Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and we are here to celebrate the second year of the top historical and war game solo list that Brant here from Armchair Dragoons and I have put together with surveys from war gamers like you, or if you're watching and you didn't vote, maybe you can do it next year. But I'm Liz. Obviously, you're my show. This is Beyond Solitaire. We have Brant from Armchair Dragoons, who is our data master who collects and handles all this data, so he's going to talk to us about it. We've got Mike Kelley from One Stop Co-op Shop. He is a game designer and solo gamer extraordinaire. And we also got Paul Wright, heavy solo gaming expert, historical game expert, and also incoming game designer. Woohoo! So, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning.
All right, so why don't we just start, Brant? Why don't you just give us like a quick overview of what we collected, how we collected it, so as we talk about stuff throughout the video, people know like where it came from.
Yeah, sure.
I made it up.
So yeah, Liz came up with this idea last year that I guess there's a giant solo gaming survey that is done on BGG every year, but tends to kind of leave out a lot of the wargaming folks and the historical gaming folks. And so last year, Liz said, "Hey, we should do this focused on these guys." All right, great, let's do it. And so we said we were going to make this an annual thing. This is the second year we're doing this. We run a survey. We use Google Forms because it's easy, and we ask folks for their top 5 solo or solitaire games, and kind of they don't have to be purpose designed for solitaire. They can be ones that you just enjoy playing solo, even if that means multi-handing or using a bot or whatever. So prop a mirror up across the table from you to pretend you're playing with an opponent, whatever you want to do. And then we do want to focus on war games, or Liz, what was the term you used? Games that deeply engage with history, I think was the term you used.
Yeah,
So,
games that seriously engage with history, something like that.
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but you can go read the original announcement and it's all there. And the one thing that is a little bit of a headache for some folks is that we ask folks to paste the URL to the BGG listing in there. And we do that because that allows us to keep the data consistent across all the entries. We don't have to worry about somebody misspelling something or not putting the appropriate edition or version of the game in there. And that's relevant. We'll talk about that when we get to the actual games themselves. But we ask them for their top 5. And then we ask a couple of fun questions at the end. How long you've been wargaming, how much of your gaming is solo, that kind of stuff. And we'll talk about some of those questions in a minute. Also, those at the end of the survey, those are just optional. So we don't necessarily have full numbers for every one of those. But then when we score these things, we do kind of college football poll scoring, right? First place vote is worth 5 points. Second place is worth 4 points, and on down. The way we've stacked the list is that we go with the aggregate score first. So the highest score across all the votes, and rank them from there. If there is a tie on that number, the tiebreaker then goes to the average. The game with the higher average wins out. On the off chance that there is both a tie in the full score and the average, we look at which one got the most number of votes. Quite frankly, usually that ends up being a tie also. So at that point, that one's a tie, and we just call it even. But that's how we rank them from the top down. And so aggregate score, then the average. And I think we had 426 total games this year. We had slightly fewer participants this year than last year. But we still have over 400 games total on the list that got at least one vote somewhere. Once you get toward the end of the list, right, it's a whole lot of games with a single vote, just because there's a ton of games out there. And everybody's got their own personal favorite, but especially toward the top of the list, there's some interesting stuff. So that's how we crunch the numbers. And that's what we come up with.
Excellent. I think this is a good launching point. So rather than kind of start lower and work our way up, I think what we decided to do is just bite the bullet and talk about number 1, because it was far and away number 1. And that was D-Day at Omaha Beach. It had the highest number of votes. It had the highest sum. It actually did not have the highest average, but that's just because it had so many votes, I would say.
Had a lot of votes, yeah.
So y'all feeling any surprise or shock that D-Day at Omaha Beach would be number 1?
I wasn't, because it was number 1 last year. I was interested to see if it fell. And if, I mean, it had nowhere to go but down, but if it fell, and it didn't, it hung on to the top spot. So that was pretty good.
So. I mean, it's not one I personally played, and just looking at length and my taste in war games these days, it's not probably one I would ever play. But I'm glad people are enjoying it.
It did not surprise me at all. It is one of my all-time favorite solo games, period, let alone solo war games. The level of granular detail, but also the playability of the solo system and just the degree of challenge that game offers. I've occasionally done well in it. I've often done very poorly in it, but I always find myself coming back to it. It is just a wonderful simulation.
Yeah. And it's been around for a while too. So I mean, it's had the chance to sort of stand the test of time. And one of the things that we'll see as we go through the list is that there are a lot of older games around, and I think part of that is folks have had a chance to play them over the years. You don't always get a chance to play every game in the year it comes out, and so the fact that these games have been around for a number of years have given more people an opportunity to try them.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's actually been some movement in the top 5, so I want to talk about that. But then I do actually want to talk about, I guess, the relative age of games in this list, because I just think it's really, really interesting. So in the top 3, so last year's, actually let's just say top 5 because there's been some movement. So last year's top 5 were D-Day at Omaha Beach, PAX Premier Second Ed, Pavlov's House, Fields of Fire, and Skies Above Britain. All of those are still kind of up in that top range, but things have moved around a bit this year. So this year's top 5 are D-Day at Omaha Beach, Skies Above Britain, RAF, Battle of Britain 1940. So an oldie surges up. It was in the top 10 last year. And then we've got Fields of Fire. I find that very, very interesting.
And PAX Premier Second Edition.
Yeah, there's PAX Premier Second Edition. Sorry, I just blipped right over it. But PAX Premier had been second last year. It is now 4th. Let me look at the relative votes. It got actually significantly more votes last year, and the sum was significantly higher as well. However, it also does have one of the highest averages on the entire list.
I do wonder, I don't know if people's thought process goes this way, but I try all of Cole's games generally, and even though they're not really, like PAX Premier Second Edition is not that similar to John Company Second Edition. They don't really feel like the same kind of game, but I could see the same people who love Cole's designs putting a lot of time into John Company. And I think, didn't that one shoot up to 9th place, right? And it was in like 18th or lower. So yeah, and maybe there's something there. Like maybe they can't fit PAX Premier and John Company in their brain at the same time, so they have to vote for one or the other.
That's very possible.
maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm insane. I'm like, oh, I like this one person's game. I clearly don't like that other one as much anymore. They can't be the same.
It is possible.
Paul, what do you think? You've played both extensively.
I have, and I love both. And when I don't have a lot of time or I'm on the road and don't have a lot of table space in a tiny hotel room, I'm going to go with PAX Premier, of course, not John Company. But for my money, I think John Company Second Edition is Cole's masterpiece. I know the ARCS people will want to have me shot for saying that, but I really believe that. And it is just such an engaging game. And while a lot of it is a dice affair with a great amount of luck, there's just such a story it tells about the East India Company and all the machinations of these various families trying to get ahead by running it. And I've never had a bad game of it with a multiplayer group, and I've really enjoyed the solo system. It presents a challenge in its own right. So of the two, I would go with John Company myself.
Interesting.
I would go with PAX by a pretty large margin. I do think Ricky Royal did an amazing job with the solo mode for both. I'm going to talk about solo here. I think John Company is amazing for multiplayer. I find that solo for John Company so onerous. Flipping through that book, I was not, even after like 5-6 plays, I didn't memorize a single part of what the solo bot would do. I had to flip the dang book every time to every page for every step. So yeah, but I think they're both amazing games.
Mike, I think that's a fair point about the solo mode in John Company. It's not for everybody.
Yeah.
I think what I like about it is it's like flipping through the brain of your opponent. You're actually studying, every kind of mechanism that the bot can use against you. And I actually think it has some usefulness in training you to play the multiplayer game, which is
I
something
agree
I
with that.
like out
Yeah,
of a solo.
Yeah.
100%. That's a great point.
That's actually a point that's come up in the coin games as well. You mentioned the whole training you for the multiplayer thing. One of the recommendations that we've used for years. So the Armchair Dragoons, we run the wargaming program at Origins, and we usually have at least one coin game there every year. They're popular. They're very accessible, even for folks that aren't into, lots of shooty bangy kinds of things. We can usually get them to sit down and play one of the coin games with us. They scale really well. And once you've learned the core of the system, it's pretty transferable across the game. So we try to have one every year. And one of the tools that we found over the years is that for somebody who's a brand new player with one of the coin games, give them a little bot worksheet. And what we tell them is, for the first 2 or 3 turns, when you're not sure what to do, follow the steps on here. Follow that flow chart, because it's not necessarily always going to give you the exact best move to make under any given circumstance, but it's never going to give you a dumb move. It's going to give you a basically competent move, and it gives you a flow chart to understand the mechanics as you're working your way through it. So they're designed for the solo mode, or if you only have 3 people for a 4-player game, like that's how you run the 4th player. But they do have utility for the multiplayer as well, definitely.
To your point, Brant, I think the latest generation of bots in the coin series has been really helpful in that regard, because those coin-driven bots are much easier to use than the classic flowcharts that you saw back with Andy and Abyss and Cuba Libre. And I think that's just going to be so helpful to a new player.
Yeah,
exactly.
Definitely.
So just talking a little bit about the movement we had in the top handful of games. D-Day at Omaha Beach was one last year, was one this year. Didn't move. Skies Above Britain was on the list last year. It went up 3 places. It finished 2nd this year. RAF Battle of Britain 1940 went up 5 places. It was 3rd this year, so 8th last year. PAX Premier 2nd edition dropped 2 spots from last year. Still in the top 5, but it had dropped 2 spots. Halls of Hegra shot up quite a bit from last year. It went up 20 spaces.
But you mean Fields of Fire, Brant?
Well, Fields of Fire is 5th, but Fields of Fire was
Thank you.
4th last year. So that's just had like a 1. It just dropped 1 to make room for RAF, basically.
Fields of Fire dropped slightly. Halls of Hegra went up. Sorry,
you're right. I'm realizing that the spreadsheet I'm looking at has some of the numbers wrong for the movement. So I got confused.
And then Mr. President dropped 1 spot. The other big rocket up the list that we saw was B-17 Queen of the Skies, went up 18 spots.
So I kind of wanted to talk about that. So we've got they're totally different games, but we've got kind of older games about flying, kind of flying up the list here. So Skies Above Britain went up into 2nd place, which is kind of fun. RAF Battle of Britain is now 3rd. It was 8th last year. And then B-17 Queen of the Skies just went screaming up the list. It was like 26th last year.
Yeah, it was a little further down there.
8, but it didn't come back into print. What happened this year? I'm not that it's bad, but it's just fascinating. Like these kind of older classics,
a weird one for me is, like I said, maybe it's not weird. The fact that it stayed so high. Fields of Fire. Am I correct that the updated rules that are coming are not released yet? Right.
You can download the more or less finished version.
Okay. Yeah, because I was gonna say, I don't know about other people. I've been totally I tried it. I'm like, nope. I'm gonna put that to the side for a year. I'll come back to it once the better rules are done. But I guess others have printed them out or are pushing through.
It has been notorious for a long time for its steep learning curve.
Yeah. I have a personal thing. So I was looking at the list. This is actually last night, Liz. And I saw Skies Above Britain had jumped to 2nd place. And I was like, Skies Above Britain. And for context, I get a lot of review copies, and sometimes they kind of fall through the cracks. So I have just stacks of games under my recording table. And I was like, Skies Above Britain. And I looked, and there it sitted still in shrink. I'm like, oh, God, how long have I had this? I think GMT sent it to me 6 months ago. So I opened it and read the rules, and actually, I don't know, 20 minutes before we started recording, I laid it on my table and did a few of the basic dog fights. and it's really fun so far. So I think we're gonna play some more Skies Above Britain after we're done. So yeah, I definitely slept on that one, but it's pretty cool. And I've even gotten to like I think where the probably meat of the game is in managing your squadrons and chasing down bombers and all that stuff. So yeah, good.
I think that game is a real achievement. I mean, it takes the things that were good about the previous volumes in that series. What is it, Storm Above the Reich and one other. And Jeremy White and Gina Willis just improved on everything and fixed some things in those earlier volumes and just created such an immersive experience. I mean, if you play that game and put on Hans Zimmer's soundtrack for Dunkirk, you know, you're going to be locked in for a number of hours. But what's beautiful about it is, like Mike was saying, you can just play some simple dogfights. You don't need to get too elaborate with it. But the real heart of the game, the thing that will suck you in for a whole day, is playing that campaign.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the first scenario, like this, they have sort of like learning scenarios. It's a single head-on confrontation. I think it was a 5-second playtime for me. So, you know, very in-depth, very meaty. But it's great because they're very like slowly walking you through the rule book. Basically, it's a nice system. It reminds me of another one that I know is it was new to the list this year, made it to number 14, Atlantic Chase.
Yeah,
right. That had a similar
designer.
Oh, well, that makes sense. Because I was going to say, I didn't pay attention to that. Yeah, because that one had a similar like tiered tutorial, like don't read the whole rule book yet, and I thought that was really nice in both cases.
For games of that complexity, I think they've done an amazing job with those rule books. They really bring you in gradually to the system.
Now, does Fields of Fire's new rulebook have slow tutorial scenarios that teach you the system?
They not only have a new rulebook coming, but they have a whole new field manual, which is for the learner. So something that's going to take through everything.
That's what we need.
I'm so ready. So I want to talk a little bit more about the old hotness, and then maybe we can talk about some new hotness. I'm very pleased to announce that Solitaire ASL came in at number 20 because the number one complaint I got about this list last year was, where's the advanced squad leader? Where is it? I was like, well, you could vote.
Well, a couple of things happen with that. So first of all, when people talk about playing ASL, like that's fine. There's this is one of those cases where the way in which we compile this list can be a little problematic for folks, because if you're an ASL player, odds are you don't have a single box of an advanced squad leader something somewhere that you only play that one box. Right. If you're an ASL player, like, it's a lifestyle. It's not just a game. And so you've probably got a wall of ASL stuff stacked up somewhere with about 16 different individual box sets. I know plenty of those people. My wife is very happy I'm not one of those people, because that would cost us another set of shelves downstairs. But one of the challenges we have is that if you're an ASL player, like, what do you put in there? And some folks, there is a dedicated listing in BGG for Solitaire ASL. And this year we just had a bunch of people pick that one out. Last year, if you'd gone back and looked up the combination of the starter kits, the different ASL starter kits, plus the Solitaire ASL listing, plus several of the other ASL modules, you'd have seen a bunch of different advanced squad leader stuff all over the list. But it's all over the list. It's not a unified thing. And so that is a case where series can be a little challenging to properly account for the way we're asking for specific individual titles. That applies to squad leader, that applies to lock and load tactical, that applies to I'm trying to think of a couple of the others. There's the Second World War at Sea series from Avalanche Press, the Conflict of Heroes series from Academy Games, which has a really good solo mode for it. If you're a fan of the series, you kind of have to pick a title to enter into the survey.
Brant, I was struck by Solitaire ASL specifically making its way onto the list. I've used that system. I have it. My preferred way of soloing ASL, when I do get a chance to do it, is just to play multi-handed. Yeah. Because there's already so much rules overhead in that game to begin with. It's infamous rule book, right? Yep, which is thick. That I feel like adding another layer on top of that with the Solitaire system is a bridge too far, pardon the pun. But I also think the beauty of that system, for those who like it, is that it will generate your opposition on the fly. So it has a lot of fog of war. You don't know exactly what you're going to encounter out there, Whereas in most ASL scenarios, it's right there on the page. You kind of see what you're going to face. So that's one of the nice things about that system. And maybe that's why for some people, they specifically listed it.
Yeah, that could be. That could be there. So one of the other statistical quirks I do want to note. So when Liz and I were taking a look at the different editions and the actual data itself as it was coming in, and we were making sure that it all kind of made sense and nobody put Ticket to Ride in there somewhere, or left stuff blank or whatever. One of the things, so there's a couple of places where we had to make a few judgment calls on some things, and one of them was the RAF games, because there's an RAF Battle of Britain 1940, and then there's a second edition, and we got votes for both. And the question that we wrangled with slightly was whether or not to combine those two. And we decided not to. And here's why. If you look up the original edition, it's just you're the RAF guy and you're defending England. If you look up the second edition, there's 2 additional modes in that box. One of them is you get to flip it around and play the Germans attacking the UK. And the other one is there's an actual head-to-head mode in the second edition box, which isn't as relevant for solo play, but you could multi-hand that and play both sides. And we made the judgment call to keep those 2 separate, because folks voting specifically for second edition might have been doing so for one of those other modes that's in the second edition box, but not in the original. Had we combined those 2, they would have jumped from all the way up to number 2, and they would have been right behind D-Day at Omaha Beach. I think the sum at that point would have only been about 3 points behind where D-Day at Omaha Beach was if we had combined them. And we did check. Nobody had voted for both. There was no one that had both of them in their votes. So that was one of those cases where we did have to make a judgment call. We thought it was a reasonable judgment call to make, given the presence of different, of legitimately new content in the second edition that was significant enough. It wasn't like it was just a graphics redo or something, or a new publisher. But if we had combined those 2, that would have jumped all the way up to number 2 and been very close to number 1.
Brant, I don't know if this will show up statistically in a future survey, and I'm not going to be the one who will necessarily contribute the data here. But there are guidelines in the back of Skies Above Britain for combining it with RAF. Yeah. So if somebody wants to get really ambitious, they can put the 2 games together in a kind of hybrid Frankenstein version, which I suppose would be fascinating, but I'm not going to be the one to do it.
Now, in addition to the whole question of like additions, which I think is really, in addition to additions, that was dumb. I apologize.
No, I'm actually here for it.
I'm also, now I know I'm kind of like probably going to make you all hate me and derail the podcast, but I'm a big fan of like fantasy war games and sci-fi war games, and the whole history aspect of this list kind of leaves some things out that I love. And I'm really interested in the games where a system is taken to a sci-fi place and sometimes better than the original. So I'm thinking of, just to name a few, I see that Resist, the David Thompson, I forget who his co-designer was for that. Resist.
It's with Trevor Benjamin and Roger Takers.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, so it was 15 last year and fell quite a bit this year. And I do wonder, I know for me, I completely stopped playing Resist because I like Witchcraft, which is like the kind of revised and I think improved version of the system, way better. But Witchcraft is a fantasy witch theme, so it would not, fit it on the list. And then similarly, I just covered Undaunted Callisto. Yep. I think that's the best that the solo has ever been. I think it's better than the reinforcements system for Normandy and North Africa, but that's not a historical thing. And then I'm a P500 supporter for Red Dust Rebellion,
yes,
which I think has a very high chance of being my favorite coin game of all time based on the early stuff I've seen so far. So it is interesting that, like, when you have, okay, hold on one second, sorry, not children.
So while I know Mike can hear me, but he's also yelling because I'm going to slip in and say it. So Brant, I think that you and I did this list this way specifically because I actually think those games have a better chance at hitting People's Choice Top 200. If that makes sense. Like, I think that I think we're going to see Undaunted Callisto on the top 200 list, like for mainstreamers within a couple years.
Yeah,
I think that Witchcraft is probably going to be on there this year. I'd definitely be willing to bet. I expect to see it. And then was the other one? Red Dust Rebellion.
Yeah, well, that's not out yet.
That's once that comes out,
that's just optimistic.
I do think we could see it because it's a very interesting coin. I actually just interviewed Jay for the podcast. So like, I think that those have a very strong fighting chance of making it on the main list. And this is just, this is my personal saw, right? Like
Well, so we do the video show here with this audience on Liz's channel. We also each fall after we do this survey, we also do a podcast over with the Dragoons because we've got our own podcast as well. And so we bring Liz on there and we bring some of the Dragoons in to talk on that one. And one of the points that came up last year, so I went back and I re-listened to, I rewatched our video from last year and listened to the podcast from last year also before we put the survey out this year, because I wanted to go back and catch, hey, we should make sure we fix this for next year, that we actually did fix it for next year. And one of the points that came up on the podcast that we had, I don't think it came up in the video discussion, but on the podcast, Mike from the Dragoons, who's one of our guys. All these guys seem to be named Mike. I don't know what it is, but it's
always a Mike.
Yeah. So Mike Colello is the guy that runs the YouTube channel for My Own Worst Enemy, which he's doing all solo gaming. He's his own worst enemy. And he plays a lot of games multi-handed as a solo player, but he's a big space and fantasy game fan. Space Empires 4X is one of his favorite games. And that question came up last year. And I know, Liz, you've still got kind of the wrinkled nose at, oh my God, those space games, they're going to show up. So, but we did build this as war and historical gaming. Yeah. And so sci-fi and fantasy war games are still, they still meet the war part of that war game thing. I think the fact that we build it as war and historical gaming, folks leaned into the historical wargaming part of that, as opposed to worrying so much about the sci-fi and fantasy stuff. But there are some in here. There definitely are a few.
Yeah, like you just can't put a survey out like this and just have it not show up.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not what we're specifically looking for if you read the description text, but it'll show up. And like, it doesn't upset me in like a big way. I'm just really trying to filter for like what historicals are people playing. And I don't really want to fight about adjudicating what is and is not a war game. So I think everybody's always looking for that cross section that they want to talk about. And it's really, really hard, I think, to draw lines and to define stuff. And so like, I'd rather just have it be a little bit more open and get stuff that I wasn't expecting than try really hard to like lock everything down more than we already have. Because I feel like this is sufficient.
Yeah. And they don't show up in high enough numbers that they're crashing the top 10 or top 20. Yeah. I'm not sure there's any in the top 30. I don't think they show up till you get down to triple digits, but there are some on the list, just not in large quantities. And again, probably because we bill it as war and historical gaming.
Yeah.
So one of the ironies here, if you think about BGG's top lists, right, which I'm not saying we have to take our cue from them. And I think we're right to put the emphasis on historical games to the degree we do, while allowing for some outliers. But I'm sure we all know what the number one war game on BGG is, right?
I'm checking right now.
War of the Ring. So a total fantasy tale, right? But it's an excellent war game as war games go. It has all these great elements to it. So there is an audience out there that's hungry for fantasy wargaming and sci-fi wargaming. I'm someone who's an omni gamer, so I'll play it all. And I think there's something to be gained from playing all those different types of games.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big lover of, besides War of the Ring, it's one of my favorites, Root, which just like some people might argue that coin games are not war games, some people might argue that Root's not a war game, but I think it all kind of fits under the same umbrella. And I think Root is heavily...
counterinsurgency in a petting zoo.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think Root is heavily... Oh, Liz left us.
Liz.
But Liz heard me say Root, and she's like, "No,
that was it." She checked out.
She's done.
The way I look at it is, if Root is good enough for them to use to teach students at the Army's Command and General Staff College, we can put it on the list.
Sure. But yeah, I agree with what y'all said. If this list is doing its own kind of historical bent, while like the top 200 list gets into a wider umbrella, I think they all have value and have some cool things to dig into.
Yeah, well, you also, there are no shortage of examples in both the gaming and literature world of historical conflicts being dressed up as something else
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
as to either sort of, avoid some hard questions from audience, or because that's the way the author or designer chose to deal with their own personal issues around the topic. In literature, the great example is the original short story collection in the book, the Hammer Slammers by David Drake. That was largely informed by his experiences with the 11th Armored Cav in Vietnam. A lot of those stories are straight out of his experiences in the jungle. Similarly, the Blood Tree Rebellion game is, I mean, that's the Vietnam War dressed up as a sci-fi game. So the fact that there are fantasy or sci-fi or not true historical war games out there doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a historical conflict somehow dressed up as something else.
It's a
Now,
great
I don't
point.
think that's the case with Undaunted 2200 Callisto. I don't think they're disguising something as a sci-fi game, but it's still the Undaunted system, just moved to a different setting. And so I see that as comparable to the other Undaunted settings. Okay, great, go do it. There's the Commands and Colors series has been used for Napoleonics, Ancients, 30 Years War, the American Revolution. There's the medieval one that also includes the Far East. So there's the samurai battles.
Yep.
To it. It's been used for fantasy stuff with the battle lore line, and there was a space combat one that's like Commands and Colors Red Alert or something like. I don't remember the exact title, but there is a space fleet battles version of that same system. Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
And I think it makes sense, especially when you have like those asymmetric like faction things. You can go a little bit wackier. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like I have Bloodstones recently, and like, it's fun to have a dragon that can fly around and blow everybody up. I guess you could sort of say that's like an analog to, I don't know, air support and helicopter squadrons and stuff, but it's definitely doing its own thing.
Brant, can I ask from a data point of view,
Yeah.
talking about games that don't exactly fit the definition, right, such as it is of an historical game? I'm thinking here, though, of counterfactual historical games. So I
Yeah.
wonder how many are popping up on the list. So, for example, there's a coin game in development. I think it's called Werewolf or something like that, which is about a German insurgency in the wake of the end of World War II. So it's
Yep.
a total counterfactual, right? But it's an historical setting. So I'm curious, do you see a number of games that fit that popping up?
There weren't very many of them on the list, and I think part of that is that up to this point, the vast majority of those legit the things that are real. The joke has always been that, when you're playing a war game, you're doing counterfactual stuff on turn one. So I mean, there's always that kind of gag, but in terms of the underlying setting, Werewolf's not out yet. So Clint still got it on, pre-order with I think it's Legion War Games is gonna be doing that one. But ones like Mississippi Banzai and the different Operation Unthinkables, which is, Churchill pushes the Allies to invade Russia at the end of World War II, like those really haven't got broad enough appeal that they're really going to show up on any kind of war game list, much less a solo specific war game list.
Right.
They're there. I just don't think they're common enough or published by prominent enough publishers that they're going to get a broader audience that they're going to show up on a list like this.
Well,
So you're
and I
more
think
likely to see the fantasy and sci-fi than any of that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in part because if you think about some of those fantasy and sci-fi ones, like Root's a bit of an outlier. Root has become its own IP, but War of the Ring is one of the most popular IPs in intellectual property history. I mean, it's Tolkien's a monster in that space. So it makes sense that War of the Ring is going to show up there just because it's got such broad appeal to folks who are fans of the IP, even if that's the only war game they ever play.
I think also it makes sense that from like a value standpoint, if I'm a buyer, if I'm playing historical war games, I probably value to some extent the historicity and like being able to look in the back of the playbook and see, what kind of things actually happened. And so many of those games already provide alternate scenarios like, hey, what if you try this crazy thing within the exact same system? I don't need to buy another product.
Yep.
So like, why am I going to go for the game that is just the wacky one-off like scenario craziness when I can already get that along with the historical stuff that I love with like the full package? You know, I don't know. I think it's a tough, not a non-starter, but a tough spot to begin with. Even if designers are designing it, I'm a designer. I don't know how I pitch that to a publisher in a way that's like sexy and going to make them go for it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, Liz is back.
Yes, I hope very much that actually stayed in.
I mean, we kept recording, so
it should
I'm recording.
Okay, good, because this is good. I want it, so you know.
Let's hear what we said about her.
Yeah, I was gonna say we talked mostly about you, Liz. It was really.
I'll just edit that out. Slander.
And like dub it in, be like, Liz is such a great person.
Oh man, AI can do all that for me now.
That's
No,
right.
So it sounds like y'all had the really good like kind of sci-fi fantasy conversation that I will happily listen back to later. But the other thing I wanted to flag before we talked about some of the data stuff is the newcomers to the list, like things that kind of shot up. One thing I think is so interesting about this list is that you can really see, and like we're going to talk about it, right? Like I think the relative longevity in the hobby of people who are contributing, because it is so consistent, and some of these older games are really still alive and like still like kind of rising up really high on the list, like B17. But you do see some new stuff. So I want to particularly shout out I Napoleon, which is just freshly on tables. So it's pretty cool that like that has like shot up already. It's a good time. We've got I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it, but Vijayanagra.
Wait, what was that? Say that again, Liz.
Vijayanagra.
3 times.
I'm not sure what I feel like people say it very fast, and I can't hear.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm glad Liz is saying it and not me.
You know what? If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right, it's whatever. If somebody would actually like to give me a short, like a very clear tutorial about how to say this, I would appreciate it, because I've actually tried to look it up on YouTube, and people say it so fast that I can't figure out what syllable gets the emphasis.
There's a pronunciation guide in the rule book or in the playbook, I think. Most of the coin games have these.
But I gotta hear it. I'm terrible at reading pronunciation guides. And then actually, it's not like brand new, but it's really cool to see Halls of Hegra fly up, because I think it's a really quality game that's relatively recent, and it's fun to see. So
One thing I do want to know, when people go and look at the master list when we've got it published over at the Dragoon site. So when people go look at the master list, you will see where we show the difference from the 2023 survey. And there's a lot of stuff in there that says new. And there's a lot of things in there that say new, but it's like a 20-year-old game. It's new to the list. It's not necessarily a new release. It did not appear on the 2023 list. So it is new to the 2024 list, not that it is a new release. I will say, Liz, your comment about I Napoleon shooting up here is fairly interesting, because like Atlantic Chase has been around for a little while now. I mean, it was out before we did the survey last year, and didn't appear on the survey last year, and it's shot up into the top 20 this year. I Napoleon's been out like 6 weeks. I mean,
it's like fresh.
Yeah. And so there's some things that have been out for a year or two and just took a little bit of time to get traction. There's some things that were released since we did the survey last summer, so they've had a year to get out there. But then, again, I Napoleon shipped in June? I mean,
but I'm really happy to see this in a way, because I sort of feel like, when we talk about the People's Choice Top 200, right, the solo list that inspired this one, and Mike, I know you probably have some ideas about this as well. People always complain about like, oh, all this stuff is only up here because it's hot and new, and like there's definitely sort of a lean towards new things, but and like it's really interesting to kind of analyze the old stuff that stays. But I feel like it'll be really interesting to watch this list develop over the years, because I feel like there's a lot of continuing respect for older titles and continuing interest in things that people really do actually seem to have played again and again and again. And it'll be interesting to see like how new titles continue to interact. Like, where will I Napoleon be next year? We were very curious about where Mr. President was going to end up, because it was like, oh, is this a flash in the pan, or is it going to stay? And so I'm very curious to like continue this project over time, because I want to see like what can kind of crack into this list of venerable classics, because I would say a lot of the titles at the top of this list would count as that. Um, and then how many of them become venerable classics themselves.
Liz, can I do a quick shout out to a game that's very important to I, Napoleon, which is one of Ted Racer's inspirations from Clash of Arms games, Legion of Honor, which he
Oh, hell yeah.
acknowledges as an inspiration, which is an incredibly fun storytelling game where, as a grognard, you can play a grognard. You're playing a soldier in the Napoleonic era, going through all those different campaigns. And not only are you worried about the battles and your promotions and all that, but you can duel other players. You can have mistresses. You can get in fights in a tavern. You can gamble. You can do all the things that a soldier might have experienced in those eras, in that era. And I think Ted kind of built on that, repurposed his system entirely to make it about Napoleon. But those two games pair well together, like, you know, a good meal and a good wine.
I'm so glad you said that, because I've actually been planning to dig out Legion of Honor and play it now that I've played I, Napoleon.
Yeah, and you can solo that or multiplayer that one.
Yeah.
Liz, you talk about, you know, which ones are going to have some staying power and which ones are going to stick around a little bit. And I'm going to have to sort of angle the head away from the camera here because I've got stuff on the side monitor on the desk next to me. But one of the things that I did do was I went back and I crunched the numbers for the top 30 or so as split by different age categories. So we asked folks, how long have you been wargaming? And we did this last year, and we put the upper bound at 25 or more years, and we realized that we needed to add a 40 or more years bracket on the end of that, just because there were so many people in the 25 or more. But the other thing that we realized is that 25 or more gets you to the late 90s, and like you've got folks that have been wargaming back to the 70s.
Yep.
We needed to add another boundary up above that. And so what I did is I split it for the purpose of these comparisons. I did the folks that had been 10 or fewer years, the folks that had been 40 or more years, and then kind of that in between. And so put the glasses on so I can see the side monitor here. The top 5 of the folks that are 40 or more years of wargaming, starting with number 1, B-17 Queen of the Skies, Skies Above Britain. D-Day at Omaha Beach was 3rd in that group.
Really?
Solitaire ASL, and then the RAF Battle of Britain. So it's all stuff that's close to the top of our list, in part because that's a big chunk of the sample of who voted. For the folks in the middle range, so that 10 to 40 years worth, RAF Battle of Britain is 1, D-Day at Omaha Beach is 2, Fields of Fire is 3. John Company's 2nd edition is 4, and Mr. President was 5th. And then for the folks 10 or fewer years wargaming, Pax Pamir's 2nd edition is the first one. Skies Above Britain, D-Day at Omaha Beach, Atlantic Chase, and Halls of Hegra. So we definitely see some of the more recent games pop higher in the list for the folks that have been wargaming for 10 or fewer years, with Pax Pamir and Halls of Hegra jumping into their lists.
Also, shorter games, I would say slightly overall, which maybe makes sense, right? I feel like if you're coming from a longer, like, wargaming background, you might be more used to games that are like 3, 4, 6 hours long, playing over the course of like a week.
And then there is a short list. So there's 7 games that showed up in the top 30 or so for all 3 age brackets. And this is alphabetically because there's no good way to sort that. Ambush, D-Day at Omaha Beach, Fields of Fire, Halls of Hegra, Mr. President, Navajo Wars, which we hadn't mentioned yet, and then Skies Above Britain. Those were the 7 that showed up in all 3 age brackets. And I'm going to publish those lists broken down by age brackets probably in about a week or 2. They won't be out with the first article that we'll have, but I will have them a little further on. That
is fascinating. Yeah, I do agree with you, Mike. I think that probably people of the up to a decade of wargaming, that's still me. But hey, just think, in 20 years we'll check back.
That's right.
But Liz, your Twitter feed reliably assured us back in 2018 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still not a wargamer.
Yes, but it's changed. But anybody can see the light, right? But you know, I do think that I mean, I know that I do favor shorter games a lot of the time because when am I going to fit it in? Or if I do play longer games, I play them in pieces. And so
Mhm.
that risks some continuity issues. But I also think that the younger gen or the newer gen, I think is probably better to say. I'm kind of interested too in we talked about kind of our issues about, okay, war, historical, how do we thread the needle? I'm also very curious to see how games that are definitely historical, but people might quibble about whether they're a war game or not. I'll be interested in seeing how those do over time as more new people kind of win their way over to this list, because I do think that we argue about it, within the community is like a technical thing. I do also think that there's kind of an age and exposure to wargaming versus the wider hobby kind of cross
Yeah.
section that's also causing those arguments.
Mhm.
Well, I think we've had these discussions and these conversations before, and we actually had them last year when we talked about this as war and historical gaming, and in part because we didn't want to fight the 387th holy jihad of what is a
Oh,
war
no.
game, that we weren't going to try and parse whether or not coin games were war games or Twilight Struggle is a war game. We weren't going to get into that. But one of the things that we've had this conversation over the years, and it's happened in the professional community as well. The center mass of the target of what is a war game is we all kind of, hexes, counters, CRTs, some, dice chucking, historical scenarios. We got all that. As you start to get further and further away from that center mass of the target, and you replace CRT or dice with card driven, adjudication, or you get away from counters and you're using cards to move things around. You may get rid of a map altogether, and now you're into upfront and fields of fire territory or something like that.
Mhm.
The further out from that center mass you get, the fuzzier the definitions get. And I think for a long time, war games were hexes, counters, dice, CRTs on a table, and folks that had been wargaming for 40 plus years, that was their initial entry into the hobby. Folks that have been wargaming for 10 or fewer years, that's not necessarily been their entry point to the hobby. And they may have come in through War of the Ring or Memoir 44 or something like that, or they may have come in through Undaunted. It's a deck building game, or It Never Snows or something similar to that. And so I think the entry point does make a difference. We did not ask how old people were. You can draw some inferences from how long they've been wargaming. If you've been wargaming over 40 years, you're not under 30. We can do math, but you could have some folks that are in their 40s or 50s that have been wargaming for fewer than 10 years.
Absolutely. Yes.
By the way, Paul put in like the little chat if we're willing to discuss it. I think it's a good question. I have my answer. Paul was asking, what solo title do you admire and play that either didn't appear on the survey or was only represented by very few responses? One of my favorite war games of all time, and this is primarily a competitive game, but I used to multi-hand it all the time, is the Combat Commander series.
Mhm.
And Europe and Pacific were both on the list last year. I think Europe was not super low. I think it was 74 last year. Neither one is on the list at all this year, at least not that I could find, which, yeah, I think is unfortunate. Although Liz, I think you played the prototype of this, right? Firefight Tactical, that has reached over 500 from GMT, so is coming someday whenever it gets in their queue. Come on, GMT, get to it. Yeah, that one, from what I played, is very much heavily inspired by Combat Commander and some squad leader stuff too, of course, and like Ambush, like all that kind of similar DNA is in there. Yeah. But yeah, I'm hoping that's because that has a dedicated solo mode that plays great from what I've seen so far, whereas Combat Commander, of course, did not have that kind of functionality. But yeah, that's my answer. What's a game that y'all maybe wish was on the list or higher on the list?
For me, I don't know that it's necessarily a specific game. I am a little surprised that none of the States of Siege games were really higher on the list. And I think part of that has to do with the very fragmented way in which they're in the marketplace today. When Victory Point Games was still around, the States of Siege series was published and marketed as this unified series, even though it was a variety of topics. Empires of America was a great game. Uh, Ottoman Sunset, Habsburg Eclipse, especially being able to link them, those were really fun games. The fact that you could use the system for something as high level as Israeli independence and Ottoman Sunset, Habsburg Eclipse, or as microscopic zoomed in as the Alamo, I think showed the strength of the system. But the States of Siege games and some of the other games that they inspired, Ben Madison's got a couple of them that are loosely based on that States of Siege series, like Mrs. Thatcher's War and the White Tribe, the game about Rhodesia, that are all very similar. But the States of Siege games, not just any individual titles, but like any of them, didn't really show up all that high on the list. And I think part of that's an availability issue. A couple that are available are all from different publishers. So I think that's part of it. And I think they've just sort of lost a little bit of oomph where they're not kind of a unified presentation anymore. They're great games. Empires of America is definitely one I'd recommend for anybody who's into that Age of Gunpowder kind of stuff. It's North America during the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, where you're the French trying to fend off everybody trying to take over Canada. And then White Tribe is on the list. It's Ben Madison's game about Rhodesia, I think is a fascinating topic. And I think he does it in a pretty nuanced way, which is tough to say about that topic. I've played the game a couple of times. I found the game's a lot of fun, but there's a little bit of tedium in it here and there where there's sort of check to see if an event happened, then check to see if an event really happened, and then go check to see if it went wrong. And so there's a couple places where you're rolling like a table to look up a table to look up a table. And it's like, we could have pared that down a little bit.
You know what, though? I think the real problem is that the best Stage of Siege game is still the zombie one.
I was gonna say the same thing. I was like, dang it, Dawn of Zeds. And now we also have what was the follow-up one that Herman did? That's
Plum Island Horror.
Yeah, Plum Island Horror.
Yeah.
I like Dawn of the Zeds better, but
I do too. Yeah. Although I'm curious what the expansion will add. But yes, that's my favorite Stage of Siege as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, but again, like when you say Dawn of the Zeds, people don't immediately think of States of Siege series. The way if you throw out one of the coin titles, people immediately associate with coin series. And that doesn't happen with the States of Siege series. And I think if we'd done this in 2011, people would have associated all those together because of the way Victory Point Games had kept those as kind of a unified line.
The title that came to mind for me, and I think it was on last year's list, not this year's list, but very underrepresented from my point of view. And I could be wrong in reading the data, but that would be one game and its follow-up, which you can play as a combined game, and that's Knights of Ire.
Days of Fire, Knights of Fire.
And Knights of Fire. I always get them confused, which are about the Hungarian uprising against the Soviets in 1956. And in that first game, Days of Ire, you're just on the ground as kind of insurgents trying to make a mark. And if you get through that, then the Soviet tanks show up in Knights of Fire, and then it gets really nasty. And of course, it's kind of doomed to failure, but it's a beautiful storytelling game, and it's really well designed for solo play. Not too surprising because David Turczi is one of the designers of the game.
I just checked; neither of them are on this year's list.
Not yet, not this year. Yeah.
So kind of in the same vein, like things that showed up either low on this year's list or didn't. So I'm gonna just kind of flag a couple of Hollandspiel titles that I would like to see get more attention, kind of in this vein. So Endurance is on the list, but it's in like the 200s. It's low this year. And then That Others May Live, Combat Search and Rescue in Vietnam, was on the 2023 list, but it didn't make the 2024 list. Also, Legion of Honor didn't make the 2024 list, like which we were talking about earlier. It's a great game. One thing I would like, it's not so much about one game, I think. It's about, this is the historical and war list. And, we talked about kind of people wanting to push it in the sci-fi direction, but I'd be really interested to see people push it in the historical direction. And like, what does that look like? And I feel like sometimes the results we get back may not even indicate what people are playing as much as what they think counts. And I would like to continue to see a broadening of that over time, because Endurance is certainly a historical game. I think a lot of people actually are playing it who would play these games. And I'd like to see stuff like that do better, but also Legion of Honor. Like, okay, it's not a pew pew game, but it's certainly like a historical game that's about being in military.
Yeah.
Like, I would be interested in kind of seeing, you know, people, if you're into storytelling games like B17, you know, I think that there's room in your gaming life for more of that stuff too.
Hmm.
One person put Obsession in 5th and said first if it counts, and so we actually did honor their wish and like put it.
Wait, Obsession like the Regency,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. And you know what? Like, my only
I mean,
argument
it's
about
historical. It's definitely historical.
yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue, and like Dan Halligan has talked about that, like on my podcast, that like it's not exactly one period in time, but it is like a historical vibe. Like I could see an argument for that because at
Yeah.
least it's based on literature of a certain time and therefore like a historical attitude, right? But
Yeah.
you know,
We actually had more votes for Obsession last year than this year.
yeah,
So this year we only had that one person that voted for it, whereas last year we had a couple of different people that put it on the list.
yeah,
So that
I mean,
was,
one way to think of this is, you know, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is not a history, but I would argue in certain ways it's an historical novel because it's so embedded in its time. There's so much
yeah.
going on in England at that time that if you understand even a part of that, the book comes alive to you in a new way. And I think Obsession captures that vibe. So I'm open to it.
Well, and
being on that list.
I think lots of war games like wear on their sleeve. Like if you read the designer's notes at the beginning, you know, Twilight Struggle is a good example of this. Like they say right in the beginning, they're like, yeah, this isn't like really how the Cold War worked. This is like more based on like how it was presented in media and how we felt it was working, you know? So
yeah,
I think already a lot of games that we think of as like very crunchy kind of historical games are really more based on a book's take or like, here's how I interpreted this version of things. Because I mean, history is never going to be a clear picture anyway, right? For anything you try to cover.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true of pretty much any war game, whether it's solo or not. So
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
what you leave out, you know, takes up as much or more space as what you put in.
yeah,
Mhm.
That's just it's the reality of trying to put things in there, and you know, people want to confuse realism and complexity with granularity, and see, you know, that's not really making a change necessarily. Um, that's a bit of a regular stump speech of mine. Is, you know, being granular does not mean you're being realistic. That just means you like counting things.
yeah. I think games are really more about like what is it that you're trying to capture, and is
Yes.
that accurate to its time,
Yeah.
as far as we can tell.
One thing that we would be a task for us in the data analysis, but quite frankly, I just don't have the time in my life to try and figure it out. It would be interesting to go back and attach publication dates to the games and see based on when a game was published. And I realize there's some judgment calls you'd have to make based on which edition, but maybe, you know, first published in a certain date. I think that would be interesting. I
Yeah.
think it would also be interesting to go back and sort of generally block things by era, like the World War II games, the Napoleonic games, the Civil War games, the Age of Gunpowder, the whatever. Yeah, you're gonna have to make a couple of weird judgment calls in there for some things that span different eras. But I do think it would be interesting to go back and take a look at how the era of the conflict breaks down. I know I'm saying this, and I promise you, I am not going to be the one to do this for next year because that's just a lot of work, and I've just got other things going on in my life.
But the data's out there. If somebody wanted to do it, they could. So.
Exactly. That's what I was about to say is we make the whole list openly available to everybody. So anybody listening to this that gets kind of a hair up their butt and wants to go do it, you've got our permission to grab the data and run with it and go do it. Like, please, we want other people taking this data and crunching their way through it a little bit and seeing what they find of interest. And if there's some comparisons you would like to do that were not, you know, we didn't publish the data set on the site in such a way that you've got all the pieces collected in a way that you could crunch it, just reach out to me. Like, I don't have a problem sharing some of that data for you to be able to do that. We're going to strip the email addresses out of there.
Right.
But,
Yeah. You leave everybody alone. But
yeah, but I don't have a problem with letting folks take a look at sort of, you know, which game got the most second place votes. Like, if you want to crunch that, fine. I don't mind sharing some of that data with you to do that. I'd be thrilled to have other people take a look at this and cut through the data in ways we didn't think about doing. Or in the case of the, you know, year it was published, I'm just not going to bother to do.
yeah. And so before we kind of been on for a little bit. I don't want to like abuse anybody's time, but there are a couple of other data things that those of you who are looking at the spreadsheets can look at. So we asked people who responded, like, how much of your total board gaming is war or historical gaming? How much of your gaming are you doing solo? A lot of people were saying over 75 on that, but we also had some less than 25%. So there's people who are solo gaming just a little bit for fun who are also responding, which I think is really cool. It means it's like becoming part of a balanced gaming diet, right? And then also, we had some good questions about are you playing online or are you playing exclusively tabletop? Most people seem to be doing a mix these days, but people are still definitely leaning towards the analog play.
So
So there's a
I
lot
have
you
those
can look
numbers
at.
up on the side screen here. When we said, do you play more on tabletop or using digital tools, things like Vassal or TTS? Exclusively tabletop was almost 43%, and mix but more tabletop was another 33%. So
Yep.
well over 3/4 of the audience is still on the tabletop for at least most of their gaming.
Yep.
And we only had 3 people that said they're exclusively digital, to where they're only doing TTS or tabletop or Vassal or something. And those
Right.
are probably folks that just live in small apartments and don't have table space. And then the other one, in terms of how much of your total board gaming is war or historical gaming, all of it and over 75% of it account for about 35% of the crowd. But Liz, to your point, the less than 25% or 25 to 50%, so the people that are half or less, that's about a third of the audience of folks that are half or less of their gaming is war and historical gaming. And then, just because I know somebody's going to ask about it, how long have you been wargaming? Over 40 years was still, even though we adjusted to over 40 years as its own category, that was still almost 35% of the audience. That's the biggest slice of that pie. And once you put them and the 25 to 40 years, that's half of the audience right there. So
Yeah.
so the folks replying to this are people that have been wargaming for a long time.
Yeah. But when we talk about longevity of the hobby, one thing that makes me happy, right, is there are people who are dabbling clearly who are
Mhm.
responding. And I think that is a great sign, because if you've got people who are just kind of wargaming or historical gaming some, that means that they're also doing a lot of other gaming, and that we're having some crossover. The
Yeah.
other thing that I'm really, really happy to hear about, though, is that, if half of the audience is people who've been doing this 25 years plus, that means the other half is not. Somebody new is coming in. What was the percentage of people who were like fairly new, just out of curiosity?
So less than a year, there were 5 folks. That's only 2.5%. 1 to 3 years is almost 10%.
There we go.
The 3 to 10 crowd, that's 23% or so. So I mean, that's folks that are, started sometime in the 20 teens. So that's a solid batch. And personally, I'm really happy to see a lot of that new blood come in, because I started going to Origins when I was in my mid 30s. My first
Yeah.
Origins was 2005, and I got involved with the War College pretty early. And for the first almost 15 years that I was involved with Origins, I was the youngest dude in the room. Like, at all those War College things, all the War College talks and events, and some of the bigger games that we were doing, not necessarily all the game events we were playing on the floor, because we've been running the wargaming program at Origins for over a decade now. Not necessarily all the people coming to play with us, but the people in terms of organizing and running and supervise. Like, I was the youngest dude in the room for 15 years. And so it's nice to have some, not just 1 or 2 stray youngsters floating around, but like, we've got a whole crowd of youngsters running around in there. And I think that's great. Because for a long time, I mean, when you're in your mid late 40s and you're still the youngest dude in the room, that's a little disheartening, you know? So it's nice to see all that new blood coming into the hobby now.
Yeah, I hope that we incidentally track some more of that over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely want more folks coming into play, get more youngsters to show up.
Yes, or at least noobs of some kind.
Yes.
Noobs of a certain age. So does anybody have any final thoughts as we kind of get ready to wrap this up? I feel like an hour is long enough, but we could go a lot longer.
Final thought, gonna go play some more Skies Above Britain later today.
Brant, I wasn't sure if you were responding to my question or not in the last.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I still think it's an interesting question. Which
Yeah.
designer is represented the most on this list
Yeah.
in terms of sheer weight and being such a great solo designer? Wouldn't surprise me if it's Butterfield.
Mhm.
I think he's
Butterfield.
definitely well represented. So Paul's question was, is John Butterfield the most represented designer on the list? Just first glance, probably, especially toward the top of the list. Again, because of the way the list works, we really kind of have to cut it off at sort of double digit numbers of votes for a specific game. Because once you get way down on the list and you got one person voting for something in first place or two people voting for something in fifth place, there's not many conclusions you can draw from that.
Yeah.
But once you've got, somewhere around 10 or more votes across 200 something votes, that's kind of where we really care about the data analysis. But I would say Butterfield probably is on the short list. If he's not one, he's two on the list of folks towards the top of that. The other one that I would expect, if you're looking through the list quite a bit, is Gregory Smith, who does a lot of those procedural aerial games, especially for Compass. Probably during the course of this recording, he's designed two more of them.
Did he do the Hunters and the Hunted? Is he also
I don't think he did those. I
Okay.
think John Krantz actually did one of those. But he does a lot of the aerial games, the America Bomber, and then where it's the Germans bombing the U.S. But a lot of those aerial procedural games. I know he does a lot of those, and Compass publishes a bunch of them.
He did do the Hunters, by the way. Yeah,
He did.
said he
Okay.
did that. Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure. But I think it's a great list. I'm happy with the responses we got. I would like to have more responses for next year. I would still, it's one of those things that technically I can describe the effect that I want, like any good software analyst, but because I don't write code, I'm not 100% sure how to do it. I would like for us to be able to figure out a way that we can get away from pasting URLs from BGG in there. BGG does have an API. They've got an interface to their database that you can tap into, that I would like to be able to figure out some way to do kind of a type ahead similar to the way the search works in BGG. So we can get folks just sort of typing their way into picking the game that they want in those spaces. It's more than I know how to make the technology do. So if there's anybody out there that thinks they can tackle that, please send up a flare. We'd love to get you engaged and help out with this, because I think it would make for an easier experience for the users.
So we got Paul, got Brant. All right, so it leaves me. Final thoughts. You know what? I just really enjoy doing this and seeing the results. It's really fun for me. I love the People's Choice Top 200, and hopefully it happens this year. I don't know what it's going to look like because Kevin Erskine kind of stepped down as the main person. But it's so fun for me to see like what people are playing. That's, I guess, our kinds of games. At least over this like kind of historical sector. And so it's just really, really good to see. I hope we keep doing this for a long time because I want to watch the data develop. And if you have opinions about this list, but you didn't vote, you need to do next year.
You need to not vote again and gripe about it on all the social media channels.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So thanks all of y'all for coming and talking to me on a weekend morning. Thanks to everybody who will watch this. Do please, like, subscribe, comment, ask questions. Go check out Brant's posts on Armchair Dragons because they're going to be awesome. And happy gaming, everybody.
Thanks so much. It was fun.